Hello, my name is Alberto, and I'm an economist researching topics about debt and inflation, which are two topics that are very important in a lot of countries around the world. Now, if you open any economic newspaper or financial newspaper, you'll find that a recurrent topic is how a lot of governments around the world are increasing their expenditure and therefore its debt. Now, debt is a consequence of governments funding its policies, which can have, of course, positive benefits for society. But on the other hand, high debt may lead to economic crisis, and it has been widely seen in a lot of countries, not only in Latin America, but also in Europe and Asia. Now, today I want to talk about another consequence of high debt, which is inflation. As you may know, inflation is defined as a general increase in the price of the things that we consume, goods and services. Inflation in general is thought as a bad thing because given that our wages are not that flexible, if prices increase, we are going to be able to buy less stuff with the same money that we have. Now, the one thing that you may not know is that high inflation may be a consequence of high debt. And this is because when governments have very high debt, they usually run out of resources to finance that debt, which again is financed by private households or private institutions. But when these institutions don't want to lend the government anymore, the government must find resources to pay its debt. And usually what they do is, given that the government owns the machine that prints the money, the government prints more money to pay for its debt. But if you print more money, you drop the value of the currency, and this increases the price level and therefore causes inflation. Actually, let's focus on the case of Mexico. So this is a plot where I am putting in red the debt in Mexico and in blue, inflation. So as you can see, during the 80s, debt and inflation was very highly correlated. When inflation went up, when debt went up, inflation went up as well. And this is because in these years, the Mexican government depleted all its resources and had to pay its debt with money. After these years, the Mexican government learned its lesson and actually reformed things in order to prohibit the government to printing more money to pay its debt. And this is called monetary dominance. And basically, we can see that since the 2000s, even though debt has been going up, inflation has not responded. And this is not only a thing that has been happening in Mexico. If we take a look at a broad set of 30 emerging market economies, during the 70s and 80s, the correlation between debt and inflation was very high, so high debt meant high inflation. But nowadays, the correlation between debt and inflation is low. Now, here's where things get a little bit more interesting. If we take a look at the last 5 years, we can see that this correlation between debt and inflation has been increasing, even though today the law prohibits the government from financing its debt with money. So something else is going on that is making people worry about the potential inflation when they see high debt. That is not exactly this mechanism of currently the government printing more money. And this is where my research comes in. So basically what I want to do is I propose a theory that highlights the role of what I call government reputation. And the idea of government reputation is this belief that the agents have about their government being committed to being prudent and generating low inflation, not only now, but also in the future. So basically, the framework that I propose is an interaction between the private sector, and the main key of my model is that agents don't know for sure which type of government they have in front. The government that they have in front could be prudent, which means it's a good government that generates low debt and low inflation, or it could be imprudent, which is a government that does not care about the inflation it generates, only about managing its debt. And therefore, given that agents don't understand which type of government they're facing, they're going to wait and see what sequence of inflation and debt the government is generating and form beliefs on which type of government they think they're facing, either prudent or imprudent. And here's what's important about or novel about my theory compared to previous ones. Reputation is going to be an endogenous outcome. That means if agents see that a government is generating a lot of debt, they understand that this debt cannot be sustained forever because, again, in the past, they have seen very high debt being unsustainable and therefore leading to high inflation. So whenever agents observe a very high debt, they're going to start being worried about the fact that in the future, the government may need to resort again to money printing. And therefore, depending on the value of government reputation, this is going to induce the agents to respond in different ways. And let me give you a particular example of what I mean. If the private sector or people in the economy, us, we have very low, we believe that the government has very low reputation. That means the government is going to be very bad behaving, managing their debt. We're going to, whenever we see high debt, we're going to expect a crisis in the future. And if we expect a crisis in the future, we're going to want to act now to hedge ourselves for that crisis, which means that now we're going to increase our wage demand. But if everybody does this, that's going to increase cost for firms, and that's going to generate that firms charge higher prices, which means that prices are going to go up, not because the government is actually doing something, because we as people believe that in the future the government will generate a crisis. This is what we in economics call a self-fulfilling prophecy, which is the expectation of high inflation in the future actually causes inflation to increase today. And this is going to happen whenever the government has low reputation. And it has nothing to do with the fundamentals of the economy. It's just the belief that in the future there will be a crisis that actually generates high inflation today. So basically, the theory that I present, or that I have in my dissertation, explains why the correlation between debt and inflation varies over time. When government reputation is very low, and this, we can see that it happens, for example, in Mexico, where I'm here presenting the same picture that I did before, but now I'm plotting my estimated government reputation. In the 80s, where debt and inflation were very correlated, that can only be explained by the government reputation being very, very low. But more recently, that debt and inflation has become disconnected. That has increased Mexican government reputation. Nevertheless, in recent years, we can observe that the government debt in Mexico is very similar to its levels in the 80s, which again, this is not very good news because this is signaling agents, well, maybe if the government continues to be in debt and in debt, that's going to generate a crisis. And that's why in recent years we have seen that even though the constitution in Mexico and in many other countries say that the government cannot use money to pay its debt, people are starting to be worried that this could happen in the future. And this is causing inflation to increase today, even though nothing has happened. So one of the main important messages of my work is that it's not only important for governments to have policies that generate low inflation, but to also signal people that they're committed to keep that promise in the future. Because at the end, inflation is not only about debt and money, it's also about the trust we have in the government. Thank you.